Welcome to I'm Becoming a Healer. Medicine is a practice that combines some science, technical advancement, and some humanity. But we are all afloat in a sea of observations that medicine proves less scientific than it could be, and often enough less focused on healing than it should be. There's a person who saw and acted on all these challenges over 100 years ago. His name is Richard Clarke Cabot. In a 4-page obituary in 1939, written by the renowned cardiologist Paul Dudley White in the New England Journal of Medicine, he wrote, "In every generation, there are restless souls who cannot be made to fit the common mold. A few of these are valuable in keeping their communities and professions in a ferment by their constant challenge to the existing order of man's thought and action. But when, in addition to these attributes, a rare individual is endowed with the divine fire and makes important contributions to the pioneering progress of humanity, then indeed we recognize a great leader." So, Saul, I am glad you brought Richard Clarke Cabot to our attention. How would you like to introduce him?
So I came across Richard Clarke Cabot a few years ago, and I don't really know how his name popped up for me, but it led to my purchasing one of his books called Social Service and the Art of Healing. And there was a particular story he tells at the beginning that really drew me in. Dr. Cabot, and just from his name, you can tell that he came from a very old moneyed family in the early history of our nation, was a man of great privilege, and he used that privilege, as you will see, in extraordinary ways. And his contributions are just jaw-dropping across many fields of medicine, spanning from hard science to clinical practice to study design, and of great interest to me, to the nature of the doctor-patient relationship and what it means to be a healer. So the story involves a patient who he describes coming into the outpatient clinic at Massachusetts General Hospital. And this was probably around 1910 with typhoid. And he said that this man was basically too sick to send home and needed to be admitted. And so he initiated the process of getting a bunch of residents and interns and medical students to do the usual job of processing this guy to admit him, which feels, by the way, remarkably modern. And along the way, the patient asks for a glass of water because he's thirsty. And Dr. Cabot comments on how really nobody responded. Everybody kind of just ignored it and kept doing what they were doing. And then the man asks again, and then a third time, and he's obviously very thirsty. And Cabot starts to muse on why no one did anything. He says, "Well, was it because we thought, well, this isn't my job?" Or he says, "Was it because we thought, well, he's going to get water upstairs?" Or is it because we thought, well, if we give him water, he's just going to get thirsty again. So what's the point of doing that? And so there's just like all of this rationalization. And basically, he ends by saying, and this is probably in the language of 1910, like, what the F is wrong with us, right? And the story felt so modern to me. What was so interesting about it is that today we often talk about how medicine has lost its humanity. And, is it because of technology or because of the profit driven system and all that kind of stuff? And this is a guy talking in 1910 about sort of the same issues. The other story that he tells at the beginning of this book is about him seeing a patient who is an immigrant Jew. And he talks about how this man comes in because he wants to talk about his fiancee who has tuberculosis and who, by the way, Dr. Cabot had seen the day prior. And he wants to know what he can do to help his fiancee get better. And what happens is that Dr. Cabot then muses on how he initially sees this man as a generic, quote, Jew, Jewish immigrant, kind of wearing this funny clothing and kind of looking meek. And then he starts to see the way this man's hand is positioned in a certain way, and the strength in his hand, and the way this man makes eye contact, and the way this man is obviously thinking more about his fiancee than about his own interests. And he starts to get drawn in, and then starts to reflect on the fact that he tends to not see the humanity of his patients. And that there's, while this man is the one in front of him, that there is humanity in all patients. And then he starts to muse on, like, why do we do this? Why do I do this? And he talks about two different kinds of blindness to the foreground and blindness to the background. Blindness to the foreground is not seeing the person in front of you.
Right
That's
in
what he's
front of you.
describing here. Yeah. And then blindness in the background is not seeing the context behind what's presenting in front of you. And for that, he gives another example. He talks about a woman who comes in with headache. And he says, we think about, we have to treat this headache. But do we think about the fact that this is a person who is struggling with poverty, struggling with having enough money to pay to put food on the table for her children, who is dealing with worry, who's living in a system where this can happen. And he says, if we don't think about all those things, then we're not really thinking about the etiology of this woman's headaches. And he says that's a failure to see background. And he talks about how he himself suffers from both of these forms of blindness and how we must talk about it. And so, anyway, that's what started to pull me in. It felt incredibly modern, incredibly relevant to today. But then, when I started to look into this guy, my jaw dropped as I started to discover that this was just a tiny, tiny sliver of
Right.
what this man has spent his life doing.
And we're going to get to that, but I do want to highlight that very storytelling he does. A couple things stand out. First of all, in modern lingo, someone might say he was engaged in cultural sensitivity or something, or
Yeah,
seeing past his bias. Oh, and then the second part, actually, you're talking about context, but actually it's about poverty, which then has to do with both context of care, which is your subject, and maybe even social drivers of health, which others have expertise in. All those things, though, were on his mind. And what's kind of helpful about the way he approaches it is that he's not really writing a lecture to others about how to be, or at least not on face, because what he's writing about is, here's my problem with myself acting as a doctor. I'm not doing as good a job as I could do, which is the most convincing way to get people to listen to you. Now, as you said, this is like the smallest part of what he's done in a weird way, although it's certainly a through line. We probably should mention when he was born and such. I think he was born in 1868. Uh, he got to his residency by the 1890s at Harvard Medical School. He completed most of his career at Harvard, and he came from, as you mentioned, a very storied family. People from Massachusetts would know this, but many of our listeners are not. But the classic line I read before I actually went to Boston was something along the lines of, here's to the city of Boston, the home of the bean and the cod, where Cabots speak only to Lowells and Lowells speak only to God. And I knew the Cabot name was a very important name. And in fact, oddly enough, in 1997, when I was seeking to fund a trip to Africa, I applied to a trust called the Ella Lyman Cabot Trust, and indeed received money that enabled me to explore the use of internet medical consultation in Africa in the late 1990s. And apparently, I didn't know it, but it was actually the trust founded by Richard Clarke Cabot in honor of his wife. So there's this history and background, but I think we should dive back into his life and some of the work that he did, both medically, which is kind of astounding, and around the biomedical model.
sure. And I think before I go through some of his accomplishments, I just want to single out another one because I think it's so remarkable. Again, early around the turn of the century, he was working in the outpatient clinic at MGH, which, by the way, was not a very prestigious job at that time, but it's
It
the one
still
that he
isn't.
wanted. Still isn't, yeah. And he realized that there was a need for what we now call a medical social worker. He realized that these patients could not be effectively treated if we didn't have an infrastructure for helping support all of the social issues that they were dealing with. And there was no such thing at the time. And he went to the leadership, and no one was particularly interested. And
Yeah,
so,
what's the point? Their view is, what's the point of this? This is not what we do.
yeah. And because he was a Cabot, he decided to self fund the creation of a medical social work service. And he ended up hiring about 13, from what I can tell, 13 of these social workers who were seeing hundreds and hundreds of patients and supporting them. And he just bankrolled them at MGH for, I don't know, years until this became a common practice around the country. And then MGH eventually picked up the tab and
Right.
established its own medical social work service.
But they were skeptical. Part of the deal was that for quite a period of time, it was sort of like, oh, we'll indulge you in doing this thing that kind of gets in the way. I remember reading about an administrator who was somewhat, quote, bemused at the bustling nest of earnest ladies, but unable to understand their relevance to his more central concerns, close quote. That's actually written by Ida Cannon, who worked with Dr. Cabot. So, yeah, he set up a service and actually wrote about the full range of issues that they could address, because so many of his medical orders made no sense to the patients. Buy dentures, quit worrying, go on a special diet, stop working so hard. I mean, all these things that he would recommend were completely pointless for so many of his patients until he had helped set up this service in partnership. And eventually that was accepted as a part of a hospital practice. But before him, that was not the case.
No, absolutely. And I think it's just worth listing some of his achievements just so people can begin to get an understanding of the scope
Yeah,
of this
let's
man.
do it.
So,
Medical
yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, so starting as an intern, he published a paper called Leukocytosis as an Element in the Prognosis of Pneumonia. And it appears he was the first to note that white blood cell counts rise in pyogenic infections, and that leukocytosis is very good supporting evidence of the diagnosis of appendicitis. A few years later, he introduced clinical hematology to the hospital, and then he published a textbook in 1896 called A Guide to the Clinical Examination of the Blood, which quickly became a standard text and went through 5 editions. Then he ended up getting interested in physical diagnosis and initially published a textbook called Physical Diagnosis of Diseases of the Chest, which then he expanded to becoming a leading textbook on physical diagnosis of the whole body, which then went through 12 editions and became kind of the national and international standard. One of the many papers that he wrote that are considered seminal is called The Four Common Types of Heart Disease. And in this paper, which appeared in 1914, he classified heart disease according to its causes and found that rheumatic, arteriosclerotic, syphilitic, and nephritic or nephrogenic heart disease made up 93% of all heart disease in over 600 autopsy cases that he studied and he pulled
Yeah.
from data. And this was a paper that Paul Dudley White singled out as, he said, the greatest contribution to cardiology in our generation, because he said it completely changed the way we think about cardiology from looking at it in this sort of histologically anatomic categorization system to beginning to look at it in terms of disease categories, which is a complete reframing of the way they think about it.
Right. It's not that those four causes are still the four causes we would talk about today, but rather it's that he decided to categorize heart disease in terms of its causal mechanisms.
Exactly.
That's a change of paradigm.
Right. And then he used that paradigm for many other studies. He ended up going into these large databases, mostly at MGH, to look at autopsies and so forth. So, for instance, he wrote a very prominent paper in JAMA on medical error. And I believe this was
I've got it. I've got it in front of me.
19.
12, buddy.
Yeah. And so what he did there is he went to, I think, 3,000 case reports and he looked at the common types of errors that physicians make. And he did this statistically. And he actually created a chart, which is again in the JAMA publication, showing for probably about, I don't know, 25 common diseases, the probability that a physician will get the diagnosis correct, and he rank ordered them, and then just summarized by talking about the most common errors that physicians make, and that, of course, was another seminal paper looking at and really introducing the field of, as far as I can tell, medical error.
Yeah, and I'll mention, like, for people who might be curious, he noticed that 25% of colon cancers were missed, 20% of hepatic abscesses were missed, similarly high percentage of cancer of the esophagus. He never found a correct diagnosis of acute kidney failure. I mean, those are things we can do better now, but the point is that he was able to say, look, this is how we make errors in medicine, and we need to study from those errors. I just reminded that by around the year 2000, there was a major national report called To Err is Human, a report of the National Academy of Medicine on the importance of learning from medical error. Of course, he was there 100 years earlier.
Absolutely. And honestly, we are just getting started. So let's move on to something else. He invented the clinical pathological conference, and he did this at MGH, and he created this whole tradition of discussing difficult cases. And one of the things he loved to do was point out his own mistakes, and he would basically lead these and then try to make the diagnosis based on the data. And then when he got it wrong, he would almost celebrate. See, I got that wrong. I got it wrong 3 times. And eventually, he got the New England Journal of Medicine to create a standard section, which is known as the CPC, where a difficult case would be presented and discussed by experts. And to this day, that
That's still
section
published.
of the New England Journal is still there, and it's one of the favorite sections of it. So he really created that whole approach. By the way, he published a book on differential diagnosis. With case-based learning, which again was a first, and just sort of set this standard of sort of open discourse, open debate, and that has been obviously central to some of the best practices in our profession. So where to go next? So one of the great stories about him has to do with talking truthfully to patients about their diagnoses. He described how when he was at Harvard Medical School, he'd been told that you should never lie to patients if you're doing it for your own benefit, like because you want to
Make
charge them
money.
more, for instance. But it's
Yeah.
appropriate and necessary sometimes to lie to patients to protect them from the pain of a bad diagnosis, for instance. And he describes a situation where he was a young physician. I think he was still being supervised. and he was told to go lie to a woman about her diagnosis and not to tell her that she had this terrible diagnosis. And so he went in there and he sat down, and this woman basically looked at him and said something along the lines of, tell me what's going on. Are you going to be truthful with me? I need to know. And he said he hesitated for a moment. He just hesitated. And she looked at him and she's like, forget it. And she got up and she walked out. And he said at that point, he realized that you have to be honest with patients. Again, that went completely against the grain of his time.
I think there's a meta lesson to that, Saul. I mean, first of all, you need to be truthful, yes. But the meta lesson is that a lot of the things we teach, there are just moments when you're in the office or in the clinic where a person who's in training or recently, a doctor is going to suddenly feel like, wait, what I heard doesn't fit. There's something off here. And you have to be prepared to sort of take what you were taught and toss it out the window in some instances because it doesn't fit the reality that's in front of you. All of us are trying to devise lessons that make sense to us, but they don't really always make sense in reality. And that's sort of what he realized.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think another aspect of Cabot that I think we should highlight is something very personal that happened to him early in his life,
Hmm.
that it was seminal to his development. And it was something extremely painful that he chose to never talk about. It was the only thing he didn't talk about until about 3 years before his death, when he decided to talk to a woman who was going to be his biographer. She never actually ended up writing the biography, and to give her a detailed account of what happened, and also to tell her not to disclose it until
Till
he
he was
died.
dead.
And so yeah, so the story is that shortly after he finished medical school, his older brother developed what sounds like type 1 diabetes. And he adored his older brother. His older brother was his hero. They were very, very close. I believe his name was Ted. And in those days, of course, there was no treatment for diabetes. We didn't have insulin, other than things like dietary changes, fasting, things like that.
Oh, I read a story about bleeding people from the 1880s, I think, in the Maryland Medical Journal, where they just bled people out, which caused them to stop urinating, which was seen as the primary symptom of diabetes. Of course, it also killed the patient. But yeah, it was a pretty bad situation.
Yeah, and it was awful. And Cabot had seen a lot of patients with this condition, and knew that it was fatal, and that it was very there was a lot of suffering involved as people became increasingly weak and confused and delirious and so forth. And as his brother's condition was progressing, his parents asked him to become essentially his brother's primary physician, which is a very difficult burden to carry for anyone, but particularly
Yeah,
when you're a
maybe
young
it shouldn't be
doctor. And
done.
his brother was the person he loved the most.
Yeah.
And so, as his brother became sicker and sicker, he was pretty much at the bedside at one point, pretty much providing him with almost nursing care along with his mother. And it became clear to him that he wanted to end his brother's suffering with euthanasia, with chloroform. And he talked to his mother about it, and because his mother was so close to the suffering, she agreed to it. He had more trouble convincing his father. His father was also obviously in great pain, but eventually agreed to it. And then
Do we
he
know
went
if his
ahead.
brother asked? Do we know if his brother asked?
Well, we'll get to that.
Okay.
Initially, he didn't say anything to his brother. His brother was pretty weak, and from what I could tell from the story, as told to his potential biographer, is that he administered the chloroform, and he actually thought his brother was dead, and he started to talk about him in the past tense. And his brother actually was not dead, and whispered something to him about how he had not finished the job. Um, and and so he then administered chloroform again, and his brother died.
God.
And he lived with this for his whole life, and it was probably one of the only topics he never wrote about, because he wrote about almost everything. He didn't write about euthanasia, but it must have profoundly shaped him
Yeah.
as a person and as a physician to have gone through that experience.
Even today, I mean, in America, depending where state you're in, this is pretty far outside the bounds of what we consider medical practice. I mean, should we say, look, this is a morally controversial action and maybe you would disapprove? How do we wrestle with that?
I mean, I think that we'll never know what Cabot thought, other than that in this particular situation, it was the best path for him. And
Yeah.
he also knew that it was something he couldn't talk about. And I think that's as far as we can go. I did read from this background about this incident that it was thought at the time that it was not uncommon for physicians to do this
Interesting.
in at least at one point in their career for a patient, but that no one talked about it and that it wasn't written about it. But what I will say is that Cabot then went on to become one of the leading ethicists, medical ethicists. And in fact, some people consider him the father of modern medical ethics, and he actually held a chair in social ethics at Harvard, in
Yeah.
addition to being a physician. And that became a central part of his life. And of course, he wrote at least one major book on medical ethics. And then, of course, from there, he started to challenge many of the ethical premises of the profession. He wrote about how physicians tend to overcharge for bad care.
Yes.
And just oh, but at one point he actually talked about how we should create an insurance system. He said that group practices should create an insurance
Yes.
system to help control costs and make sure physicians are paid fairly. And what I should say about all this is that this did not go over well,
No,
and he
at every
came very
turn.
close to being expelled from the Massachusetts Medical Society, and really ostracized for expressing these views, and also for pointing out how often physicians make mistakes.
I mean, what's kind of strange is that, I mean, he had a privileged position by virtue of his birth, by virtue of the money in the family. I mean, that pedigree is hard to ignore, but he was willing to take risks with it, given that he had those privileges, and he was willing to go so far as, to essentially talk about how doctors were cheating patients and how the profession was cheating patients, which really upset people nationally. Even the editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association wrote against his views. I just read this in a 1925 article from Time magazine, but he was very upsetting, and I think at a minimum, what you'd say is, yes, he had this privilege, and yes, he went ahead and used it to try to make the arguments in the cases that he felt he could do, which I think is speaks a little bit to our time as well.
Yeah, and I also suspect that one of the reasons he has not made it into the pantheon, and it's not somebody we talk about in the same way we talk about, say, Sir William Osler or Francis Peabody and
Yeah,
others, is
yeah,
because he was seen as a troublemaker, because he challenged the establishment. And I think that Paul Dudley White alludes to that in the obituary. That
yes,
this was kind of a feisty guy, but in many ways, that's what I think is part of his greatness, is that he wasn't primarily an institutionalist who was trying to just make it and move up the ladder. This was a man who spoke his mind and followed the evidence, and I think that was critical. The other thing I'll say about him is he was an incredibly generous spirit, and I just want to give a couple of examples of that. So, for instance, I mentioned earlier this story of how he criticized himself for his bias, for seeing this Jew as just a Jew initially before he
Egypt.
saw his humanity. Once he discovered that this man was going to have to move to Colorado to take his fiancee to essentially to a place where the air is fresher and where she had a better chance, in theory, or at the time they thought, of recovering from tuberculosis. He thought about how this man was going to give up his dry goods business and how he would have to start from scratch. This man was talking about working in the mining business, which he knew nothing about. So Babbitt provided him with some letters of introduction to people he knew in
Yes.
Colorado who could help introduce him and help him get a job and so forth. Again, that's very typical of how he
Right.
functioned.
He stepped, I mean, the key thing is he stepped right out of the realm of medicine. He stepped right outside of the ordinarily billable CPT code of a 99201 or whatever it is, or 205, and kind of went ahead and did a bunch of stuff that you can't bill for in the current system because he thought that that's what would bring the patient health. We have another story of that nature.
About the one with watercolors?
Yes, absolutely. We have a watercolor story.
Why don't you tell the story?
So it's a well-to-do elderly lady brought in by her son. She's depressed. She's in an unrewarding marriage, and she feels like her life has no meaning. As he wrote it, she just mopes around. Cabot learned that she was a skilled painter. For a number of years, she'd provided watercolor copies of seashells for a biological museum of such high quality that she was an expert in demand. So he proposes to her that she should reach out to the museum to see if she could do this work again. And she says, quote, "No one would want my painting now. I've completely lost the knack I had for doing it well." So, despite her saying that, he reaches out to the museum. He finds out they kind of still need somebody to paint these kinds of watercolors for the museum. And he persuades the director to write a letter on official letterhead stationery, a business letter expressing the desire of the board of directors to enlarge their collection of the color drawings that they need. So she gets the letter and she's resistant. She doesn't think there's any chance she could really do this anymore. So he lured her into a conversation about the fascinating details of watercolor technique, the advantages and the disadvantages of different kinds of paper, of Japanese rice paper, of camel hair brushes, the choice between squeeze tube colors and moist colors and paints. There, he gets into painting technology with her. She finally gets enough interest that she decides she's going to try to accept the work, and she returns to do it. She starts to do more of it, and then she feeling a little better, but not fully better. But by the way, he's done this through interceding on a letter. But she says, "Look, I still feel bad, particularly the relationship with my husband isn't very good." So he persuades her to keep a diary. And in the diary, she's not supposed to just record her feelings, but her actions. And listen to this. This sounds like behaviorism. She used to record the number of times she cried each week and the duration of each cry. So on a weekly basis, she comes in to show him her diary of the crying. She then tells him eventually, when I start to cry, and then remember that I shall have to see what time I begin and what time it is when I stop, and then write it down and then show it to you, I sometimes burst out laughing at myself and don't begin to cry at all.
Yeah.
That's quite a story,
It
isn't
is,
it?
it is. And I think that what's extraordinarily rare is a physician who practices medicine this way while also making contribution after contribution to fields like hematology and pulmonology and physical diagnosis and medical education. Another thing that he did,
Yeah,
another,
I know where we're going with this. We're going right into the social sciences
I think it was called this Cambridge Somerville study to try to track
for delinquent youth.
for delinquent use. Yeah.
Yeah, so they accrued several hundred delinquent youth, people who were flagged by teachers in schools as troublemakers, as people who they were really worried were going to wind up in a life of crime. And the design of the study was to follow them prospectively over time, which is a pretty costly endeavor. I suspect he funded it all, but they matched them. They'd always find two who were matched on a wide range of variables. They would bring these they would, on like campouts or events where there would be skilled observers who would rate them on 11 or 10-point scales for a wide range of characteristics. And then they would match the youth as many characteristics as possible. So they always have a pair who are matched. Then they intervened, and the intervention was mentoring with a skilled friend, somebody who would take the person on and try to help them. A little bit like the Big Brother, Big Sister program. Today we'd call it mentoring. And he insisted that they flip a coin to figure out who would get the mentor so that it would be a randomized social experiment over many, many years to see if they could make a difference. Now, I have not read the results of the experiment, but if I understand correctly, it went on for decades, maybe still going on today, not the same people, presumably. But it's kind of striking that he branched right out into social science experimental work while being a doctor, practicing medicine and teaching medical ethics. We still haven't touched all the fields he touched. It's kind of a stunning thing.
Yeah, and the remarkable thing about it is that his day job was basically private practice, and he kept meticulous records in a kind of fancy practice in Boston, and actually, I think those records have been preserved. Interestingly, I don't think anyone has written a biography of this man. There are many biographies of, say, Sir William Osler. I don't think anyone's written a biography of Richard Clarke Cabot. The closest thing I could come to is a book called Private Practice, which was published 20 years ago. And the subtitle of it is In the Early 20th Century Medical Office of Dr. Richard Cabot. But what that book is about is it's about the evolution of private practice starting at the turn of the century. And because this particular physician had preserved his records, it created a good source for doing that book. But the book doesn't primarily focus on the life and the contributions of this truly extraordinary physician.
The author, by the way, is Chris Krenner. He was a fellow medical student with me at Harvard Medical School, actually. I just saw it. He was a very nice guy, but now I'm kind of curious about the book. But it's not about Cabot per se, it's about the private practice.
Now, it's interesting coincidence. You have two connections now to
To the
this
same
man.
guy, right. So I think we also need to talk about medical chaplaincy for a moment. Many of us who practice in hospitals do see patients where there's a question, what do we do now? There's a complex life situation, there's a complex medical situation, and people are suffering.
Yeah,
And
so
I mean,
he is also credited on the homepage of the clinical pastoral uh, website, for the National Organization of Clinical Pastoral Care, as their founder. And so he basically partnered with a minister named Russell Dix because he felt that we needed to have a profession, just like we had social workers. We also needed medical social workers, which again he created that. We needed to have chaplains who could minister spiritually to patients, and so he basically set up a framework for clinical pastoral education. And he wrote a book, and he's the first author, but Dix is the second author, called The Art of Ministering to the Sick. And ministering is to be taken literally. And so again, that's another one of his extraordinary achievements is really being a founder of this other profession of clinical pastoral education.
and I have to say, I have always at times asked patients if they would like to see a chaplain in our hospital. It changed a little bit as I began to prepare for this episode. I sometimes began to feel that we were taking care of hospitalized patients and hitting something of a conundrum, an end game where I didn't know where to go or what to do. It wasn't just a matter of finding a new medical intervention. Social workers didn't know what to do. And I sometimes would just turn to the patient and say, is this a situation where you would like to speak to our chaplains? And more often than I expected, people said, yeah, I would like that at this point.
Yeah, and by the way, my wife is a chaplain and a rabbi.
Yes, cool.
Chaplaincy is multi-denominational. So when you
Yes.
when you train as a chaplain, you're training with rabbis and priests and um, other pastoral leaders, imams. Anyway, it's completely non-denominational, and that again is, I think, something that you can trace back to the early origins of CP. But he also wanted it to be professionalized. He wanted these people to be specifically prepared to work with people who are suffering and ill.
Yeah, at each juncture, he seems to recognize the limitations of the medical profession and say, "Well, how can we improve this? We can't fully fix the doctors. You know, he's preaching to his doctors about what to do differently by talking about what he does wrong, and then at the same time, he's asking if he has the power to set up a service around the doctors who are not going to be able to do everything." It's kind of an
Exactly.
interesting
And by the
response.
way, on top of all this, he also conducted the MGH Glee Club and was an accomplished violinist.
Oh my God, that's astounding.
But I think this takes us to, in many ways, what might be the most important point about what we can learn from this man and his life. What I find so extraordinary and endearing about him is that despite the fact that he was a towering giant, in my opinion, he also feels accessible. He feels so human, and this isn't Albert Einstein. This is somebody who's extremely curious, extremely intelligent, who finds joy in his work and who is interested in everything. He's interested in people. He's interested in in introspection. He had a very happy marriage with his wife for 40 years, and that was something that was, I think,
Everyone noticed it.
everyone
Everyone saw
noticed
it.
it. And so this was a man of joy. And I want to read something from his book, Social Service and the Art of Healing. And by the way, I have to say, I have 9 of his books now, and
I
it's
have two.
but even 9 is a small sampling of this man's books. I don't know how many
Wow,
books he wrote, but if you go to, what's it called?
8 books.
8 books. They just go on and on. And I have no idea how many books he wrote, but I were to recommend one, it would be Social Service and the Art of Healing. And he quotes someone named Stevenson, who refers to the duty of happiness. And he says, from another point of view, the duty of seeing the foreground. And if you recall earlier, we talked about the foreground as being seeing the person in front of you, seeing what's happening in the moment, being fully present. And he says, from another point of view, the duty of seeing the foreground becomes what Stevenson calls the duty of happiness, not merely in some far off divine event which shall gloriously consummate and fulfill the hopes of today, but along the road in the details of meetings, serving, directing our patients, in the very process itself, and not only in its results, we must find our happiness. Why must we? Because the man that doesn't enjoy his job never does it well. And because if you do enjoy it, you will make others happy. If it is only the fully achieved result that you enjoy, you will be glum or grim most of the time. One ought to enjoy the motion of walking down a corridor, the actual questions and answers by which we get at our patients' needs, the simple technique of accurately reading a thermometer and neatly recording the results in a chart. One ought to get pleasure out of the eyes and faces, the gestures and tones of our patients and our fellow workers, the rich roll of the Scotsman's brogue, the musical undulations of the Englishman's voice, and the quick, sympathetic flash of the Italian's eye. How stupid to front all these guests with the same stereotyped kindness, the same military precision, or worst of all, the same dull inattention. Let us be in it. Let us catch the vital impulse of happiness that there is in sight, sound, and touch, in the infinite novelty and unexpectedness of the foreground.
Just be present. Be here now, as Ram Dass said.
Yes, and there's more. He says, there is much else in that foreground of which I should like to speak. To be blind to the humor of the moment or to the pathos and the tragedy of the moment, to meet them all with the same engaging smile or the same businesslike firmness, oh, it is a performance fit only for lay figures on wheels. God grant we may act tomorrow a little less like stuffed images. No wise thought of the future, no deep scientific ardor for the truth. And what he's talking about is what we've referred to as the efficient task completer. He's saying, don't be an efficient task completer. Don't just be someone who goes through the motions. Don't be to someone who puts on like a kind of professional demeanor and interacts in the same mechanical way with every patient. For God's sakes, be a human being. Find joy in your work. Connect with your patients. And I think that's the message that he's conveying to us, at least as I read it.
Really interesting thing, particularly when you're going through professional training, because so much of what's happening at the moment that I was in training is being aware that one, I'm being rated and I'm being scored, and two, I want to be scored better rather than worse. And I recall this conversation with one of my attending physicians at Massachusetts General Hospital of all places, who said, look, The idea here is that you need to do a good job here so that you can get on the next stairwell or escalator to the next thing after that. And, if you do well in that, then you can get to the next step after that. And in fact, I believe this particular faculty member had gone from, Harvard College to Harvard Medical School to a Harvard residency to a Harvard professorship. I think we called it Preparation H at the time. I didn't necessarily know what I made of that when he said it. I realized that I was definitely, and still am to in many ways, someone who's trying to get the right marks, the right scores. I guess the question is, sure, Richard Clarke Cabot, having enormous talent and enormous wealth, steps outside of that and urges people to be present in the moment for the person in front of them. Is there a risk that that's harder to adopt if, let's say, you're an international medical grad, you're currently frightened out of your mind by things going on in the current administration, you're trying to get the best possible board scores and be accepted to a residency without being driven out? I mean, is there a luxury implied by Dr. Cabot?
I think that's a great question. I mean, obviously, he was someone of privilege, of
Yes.
extraordinary privilege, and
Yes.
so he could take risks, and he certainly did. And it's impossible to know what he might have done had he not had
Yeah.
those advantages. And he could take on the establishment, and so I think that that's important. But what I think actually drove him was curiosity and joy, and so
That's possible. That doesn't seem necessarily entirely out of reach, right?
yeah, yeah. When I think about what lessons I learned from reading about this man and seeing what he accomplished, it's a reminder of the importance of, again, of being open, of speaking your mind, of finding connection in every interaction with patients, of questioning your own biases, of never being so narrow that you just specialize in one thing, but you remain open to pursuing everything that is of interest to you, obviously, while still getting your work done. I think he also sets the standard for being self-critical in a way. This
Yeah,
is a man
openly
who
so,
who
without it being a terrible negative,
yeah,
actually.
and it just didn't really bother him to point out his own mistakes and to reflect on himself, and that obviously reflects an enormous amount of, I would say, inner security, that he was able to do that. And I think in particular, I love his framing in the beginning of social service and the art of healing, of this idea of not losing either the foreground or the background in your work
Yeah.
and in your life. And he says these are basically flaws that we are all prone to, is losing sight of the foreground or the background. And I think that was central to the way in which he interacted with people, with patients, and to some degree with science.
One of my take homes, and it's just coming to me now, is that we talked about his relationship to his spouse. We talked about his relationship to Ida Cannon, who was his partner in the social work at Massachusetts General Hospital. I think you mentioned Reverend Wilson in terms of chaplaincy. Ida Cannon, by the way, was the sister, as I recall, of Walter B. Cannon, who was a major Harvard Medical School physiologist. But in each phase of this work, he's doing it with other people. So while he's very self driven, his way of enjoying and succeeding is to share himself with others and to find ways to pursue what he's going through with other people. It doesn't seem to me like it's a towering figure in isolation. He's a towering figure in partnership. And that seems important to me.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that made him capable of doing so much is that he never needed to own anything. So as soon as he had created the social work thing, he just found very talented people to run with it. And of course, he
Yeah.
bankrolled it quietly, but he just let them run with it. Okay. He did the same thing with clinical pastoral education. He did the same. Each time he kind of founded something, this incredible
Yeah.
social science trial, which went on actually for several decades after he died. He basically just got things up and running, found talented people, and then just was delighted to see those things happening. And I think that was another characteristic of him, which is that he didn't need the credit. He just wanted to get these things going and to find great people to carry the torch.
Well, I think going forward, I'm going to continue to focus on these things, particularly the willingness to be self-critical and to share in partnership with other people about what I'm trying to understand and do better. As I said at the beginning, it's helpful to understand that some of the sharpest critiques of what the medical profession is today um, have been with us all along from people who were bold enough to state them up front, even in the early 20th century. For me, this is a very inspiring person who I think I can use as an example. Saul, any final thoughts?
No, I think you put it so well.
Thanks so much, Saul.
Thank you, Stefan. We hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of On Becoming a Healer. If you have and you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so now. Also, please rate us on the Apple Podcast app, as it will help others find us. And if you have a few moments, leave a review. In addition, if you'd like to make a comment about this episode, we'd love to hear from you.
There are a couple ways to do that. If you're using the Apple Podcast app, then just open the episode website link and enter your comment there. Or you can directly go to the website contextualizingcare.org, select the podcast tab, and then scroll down and click on the episode. There you'll find the same comment box. Finally, you can always reach us at onbecomingahealer@gmail.com.